Afrika will now be home to a technology transfer hub which will help kickstart the production of COVID-19 vaccines on the continent. The World Health Organization announced that Cape Town-based Afrigen Biologics will be acting as the hub, manufacturing mRNA vaccines and providing training. WHO Director General Tedros Ghebreyesus says that several companies have shown interest but will be selected on a criteria which includes the terms they will be willing to share their technology.
I'm delighted to announce that WHO is in discussions with a consortium of companies and institutions to establish a technology transfer hub in South Africa. The consortium involves a company called Afrigen Biologics and Vaccines, which will act as the hub both by manufacturing mRNA vaccines itself and by providing training to a second manufacturer called BioVac. In time, Afrigen could provide training to other manufacturers in Africa and beyond. The Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention will provide guidance through the Partnership for African Vaccines Manufacturing. WHO is facilitating this effort by establishing the criteria for the technology transfer, assessing the applications, developing standards, and providing ongoing support and training. We are now in negotiations with several companies that have indicated interest in providing their mRNA technology to the hub. This selection will be based on how advanced the technology is in terms of clinical efficacy data and on the terms under which the company is willing to share its technology.
At the same time, President Cyril Ramaphosa has welcomed the initiative, saying that this will change the narrative that Africa is a center of disease and poor development.
The vaccines that are made in their billions in the countries in the north, we do not have access to them. And other countries in the north have a huge surplus. And we've been saying vaccine nationalism must come to an end, because this pandemic we are facing together, all of us around the world, and it is just not equitable and not fair that some people in certain countries, and because they come from rich countries, their lives are worth much more than the lives of those in poorer countries. We need solidarity. We need equitable access. But we also have called for a waiver, as you correctly said, which the WHO supports, of the TRIPS measure, to enable all countries, those that can, to be able to have the wherewithal, the IP, to be able to manufacture vaccines.
Right now, joining me to talk about this is vaccinologist at Wits University, Professor Shabir Mari. Prof, good evening and thank you very much for your time. Let's get then the backdrop of this. Of course, it's the fact that there is this ongoing vaccine nationalism, if you will, or otherwise an inadequate supply of vaccines, particularly in the poorer countries, and has created this inequality. So a third work stream of the WHO has come up with this concept of trying to ensure availability of vaccines, and they are calling it the technology transfer hubs. Essentially a huge big learning center where they would have the creators, the researchers, the rights, those who hold the rights, and pharmaceutical companies come in one and help countries to be able to get this technology. Is this the way that will help us, particularly with the supply issues?
So it's certainly an extremely positive start, but at the same time, I think we need to be sober in our expectations. So what we're talking about is really a hub which will look at capacitating individuals. And the success of this hub will largely depend on the engagement of the public sector, the government itself, as well as the private sector, to take it to the next step in creating the necessary sort of resources. Is this going to be the answer to COVID-19 vaccines? Unfortunately, not in the immediate future. For a country to be able to set up manufacturing facilities such as South Africa, where there's very little skill set available, would take at least 2 to 3 years before we actually see local production of COVID-19 vaccines. And I'm not referring to the type of fill and finish that takes place at the Aspen plant for a J&J vaccine. That is one end of the spectrum of vaccine manufacture, but it's not actually producing the active ingredients that goes into the vaccines. So it will be at least 3 years before South Africa would be able to actually produce a COVID-19 messenger RNA vaccine. Yeah. So I think we need to just be a bit sober in our expectations. But at the same time, this is an important step because messenger RNA technology is probably going to be the future of many other vaccines that will be developed and required in the next few years. Yeah. So it again places us in a very competitive position to take on the baton in terms of local vaccine development as well as manufacture. But again, that is only going to be possible with government providing more funds for research and development in academic institutions, as well as for the private sector coming on board and taking on what is usually a very low profit margin type of a business outside of this pandemic type of situations.
Now, a call for interested parties was made around mid-April, and South Africa was one of those countries that raised its hands, and there were various criteria. There could be countries that just want to host the hub or countries that want to contribute technology as well. South Africa raising its hands for both. Do we have capacity to do that?
Well, we've got capacity to be able to get started. I think we've got the critical skill set to be able to make this work. Provided that academic institutions across the country actually pull together in the effort to make it work, and that Afrigen itself is engaging across the different institutions. So we certainly have got that skill set in South Africa, and that probably places South Africa in a very competitive position compared with many of the other African countries, including the 3 other countries that you mentioned, where a similar sort of a hub would be established. So short answer, we certainly is a positive development, something that we need to keep an eye on, but at the same time, that is not going to detract from the current challenges that we're going to face in the next year to 2 with regard to getting an adequate percentage of our population vaccinated, because that vaccine supply, unfortunately, we're still going to be very dependent on outside procurement. Yeah.
I'm going to come to those bottlenecks in a moment, but I want you to go back to what you have mentioned just now around the fact that this is, of course, one aspect that will help us. The other aspect is the one that the President is raising, the waiver of the TRIPS measures. How different are these 2 processes?
Well, they speak to each other, and I'm actually involved in a few early stage studies with messenger RNA vaccines, where those companies are very wanting to actually have the technology transfer done to South Africa to become a manufacturing facility. So I'm not talking of the Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna, which is sort of an animal of its own right now, but I'm talking of many other smaller biotech companies that do have the ability to develop this messenger RNA vaccines against COVID, and they're extremely keen to ensure that there's local manufacturing capacity and that tech transfer takes place. So this is over and above the discussions around TRIPS. This is a much more focused and concerted effort of those companies, which are largely being funded by the Coalition of Epidemic Preparedness Initiative, CEPI, to actually take the vaccines to the next stage. So I think, like I said, certainly there will be takers with biotech companies that have messenger RNA vaccines that would be willing to engage with this sort of an initiative. Yeah.
Let's talk then about the bottlenecks. The WHO indicating that there are some bottlenecks when it comes to reagents or components that are required, particularly upstream. How critical is that challenge, and how will that impact on supply going forward, especially in the immediate while we wait for this hub to be set up in 3 years?
So it's not going to be a challenge for the hub in South Africa because the sort of quantities that you require is fairly limited. And like I said, like you've mentioned, it will probably take 2 to 3 years to set up, and then years again before we actually start manufacturing any of the messenger RNA vaccines, including COVID-19. But certainly the shortage of reagents is a major issue that is being experienced in a place such as India, where the Serum Institute of India having expressed that one of the reasons why they've been lagging behind the targets is the quantity of vaccines they're able to produce for the COVAX facility and to be made available to low-income countries ease the blockage, in a sense, that's been placed on importation of reagents to the Serum Institute of India. And this is a company that has been in existence for close to 20 years now. And if they're experiencing those sort of problems with regard to getting the reagents, clearly a newer startup is going to be much more challenged to do the same. So yes, it is a global problem right now, especially for manufacturers in low and middle income countries.
So we should be pushing, Prof, essentially for those countries to loosen those restrictions, because there are some restrictions. For example, certain countries would say you can't supply other countries while we still have demand here in our own country. So those reagents then become unavailable.
Correct. And I think probably from over the next 2 quarters, we will start seeing greater availability of those reagents, as well as vaccines, because majority of high-income countries will already have vaccinated about 70% of the population within the next 2 months. And beyond that, there's going to be very little reason for them to hoard either the vaccines or the materials that are required to manufacture the vaccines. So we certainly will start seeing an opening of the market in terms of gaining access both to vaccines as well as reagents that are required for the production of vaccines outside of those high-income countries that up to now have largely been somewhat obstructive in allowing for that to happen.
Wits University vaccinologist Professor Shabir Mahdi, I appreciate your time and thank you very much for joining us tonight here on In Focus. When we